Hello, my name is Dr. Robin West, and I am Professor of History at Madisonville Community College. I have here with me today Dr. George Humphreys, Extended Campus Director at the college and author of a forthcoming history for the University Press of Kentucky on Western Kentucky politics since the New Deal. Welcome, Dr. Humphreys.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here today.
It seems like almost any history of Kentucky politics must start with 19th century Kentucky poet James Mulligan's description of our politics.
And what was that description? That Kentucky politics are the damnedest, right?
The damnedest.
Yes. I always think it's kind of interesting because he starts off by, talking about the beauties of Kentucky, all of its attributes, and then concludes about Kentucky politics that they are the damnedest. I'm not always sure that that's the case. I wrote a history of Oklahoma politics, and I saw some interesting facets of that state's politics as well. But that's what now people usually start off talking about Kentucky politics.
In your research, are there stories you found that corroborate Mulligan's description?
Oh, yes, many, and I could go on for hours, I suppose, but I'll pick out one, and that is the 1938 U.S. Senate Democratic primary race between incumbent U.S. Senator Alvin Barkley from Paducah and boy wonder Governor Alvin Benjamin Chandler, Happy Chandler. And I think it's useful to maybe go back a little bit, if I digress for a moment, and mention that Barkley was a figure of major importance in New Deal politics. Of course, you're an American historian, and you might recall some of the the ins and outs of the court packing scheme that went on after the 1936 election, and the probably Franklin Roosevelt's first major defeat when he attempted to pack the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court was knocking down New Deal law after New Deal law. Anyway, in the middle, or towards the end of that, Senator Joe Robinson from Arkansas, who was the majority leader, weighed in. He had a major reason to try to get a court reform, because he felt like he was promised a seat on the Supreme Court. And in the middle of July, this fight is going on in Washington, D.C., which you may recall was not air-conditioned at the time. And after a very rough week of defending the court plan, he dies. And just goes home sick, and they find him dead in his hotel room that the next morning. In any case, Barkley, in a very tough race, becomes majority leader, takes Robinson's place, but only after FDR weighed in and used his influence, most notably in a letter, the Dear Alvin letter, that was written to Barkley because Roosevelt was desperate to have Barkley as majority leader, rather than a fellow named Pat Harrison from Mississippi, who many people felt would be hostile to the New Deal. Barkley was a warrior for the New Deal, had been a strong, progressive, liberal sort of senator. Anyway, to carry the story forward a little bit, a somewhat diminished but not defeated Roosevelt goes on in 1938 and attempts to purge the Democratic Party of some of his opponents. And his opponents struck back somewhat by, I think, encouraging Happy Chandler to run against Barkley. Well, that would have been a huge defeat for Roosevelt had had Happy Chandler won that election. In any case, there was one classic part of that campaign. Chandler was the boy governor. Barkley is the aging, politico. And towards the end of the election, well, Chandler ends up in the hospital, and supposedly he is poisoned by the Barkley campaign, drinking his ice water. Ends up in the hospital for a week, and Barkley, of course, denied any involvement with that. And for weeks afterwards, as the campaign ran on, every time Barkley would give a speech, he'd pick up his glass of ice water, hold it up, and look at it, and shudder, and wonder whether to drink it. And so anyway, but that's an example of Kentucky politics of those days.
And of course, Barkley won that election and went on to a long, distinguished political career in the Senate, and actually became vice president in the 1948 election upset when Truman defeated Thomas Dewey.
Yes, after 10 years basically as majority leader, and he assisted Truman, who looked like he was going to be defeated in that election. That was the Thomas Dewey election. Of course, you remember the classic thing of people holding up the Chicago Tribune predicting that Dewey had defeated Truman. Barkley helped immensely in seeing, in that upset. Went on to 4 years as vice president, and actually made a run for president in 1952. Very, very short, but going into the National Convention that year, Truman backed Barkley, and even though he was, I think, about 71 years old at the time, but Labor felt he was too old and pulled the plug on him. But he wasn't done yet. In 1954, he was reelected to the U.S. Senate, goes back to Congress as the junior senator from Kentucky. And something that's always very interesting about him is he dies in 1956 giving a speech to a college crowd at Washington and Lee University, and he's up there and he says something to the effect that I would rather sit on the back row, for I'd rather be a servant in the house of the Lord than sit in among the seats of the mighty, and collapsed and died.
Be careful what you wish for.
Yes.
Yeah, what about Happy Chandler? Whatever happened to him after his loss?
Well, Chandler probably felt that losing to Barkley was going to kill his opportunities in politics. But fortune always seemed to smile on Happy Chandler. So in 1939, Senator Marvel Logan dies in October of that year, and of course Chandler's the governor. Governor has the power to appoint vacancies, to fill vacancies in the Senate. So he cuts a deal with his lieutenant governor, Keene Johnson, and steps down. Keene Johnson goes ahead and fulfills the terms of the bargain and appoints Chandler to the U.S. Senate. He remained there through 1945, went on to be Commissioner of Baseball, where he is now in the Baseball Hall of Fame. He took great pride in having a role in integrating baseball and making it possible for Jackie Robinson to, and then made another run, became governor again in 1955, continued to be a force in Kentucky politics up well into the 60s.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how you came to define what Western Kentucky is, and why you thought a book on Western Kentucky politics was needed.
Well, it was a more difficult task than you think. What I started looking at this book as many as 10 or 15 years ago when I was still out in Oklahoma and had decided that, determined that there really had not been that much written about Western Kentucky. So I felt that there was a big gap there, and but I also found that there was very little in the way of agreement about what Western Kentucky really is. I started talking to people like in the General Assembly, for example, believe that Western Kentucky is anything west of I-65. However, I don't see much in the way of common interest between folks in Elizabethtown and those in Paducah. So I felt like the line needed to be drawn much further west. I found folks in Bowling Green who objected to being included in any history of Western Kentucky. I was quick to point out to them, well, you've got a university that sits up here on the hill. Change the name from Western Kentucky University, and I'll take you out. But anyway, I ended up deciding that Western Kentucky more appropriately should be, I take a line from the eastern edge of Hancock County down, include Ohio County, Butler County, Warren County, Simpson County, and so anything west of that line is in fact Western Kentucky. I think that works for a variety of reasons. It's a land rich in rivers. It's in contrast to eastern Kentucky. It's basically lower than the uplands of eastern Kentucky. It's essentially conservative and fairly democratic.